Good evening. Good evening to all the participants here, both from India as well as outside India. Thank you for taking the time to join this webinar. Now, we are going to be speaking about the laws regulating IVF in India. Before we get or start off with the webinar, let me kind of firstly introduce ourselves, give you a little bit of an insight into the IVF industry in India and the sector itself. As we are all aware, healthcare is probably one of the largest sectors in terms of revenue and employment in India. The hospital industry itself accounts for close to around 80% of the healthcare market. And we've witnessed a huge amount of investor demand, both from global as well as domestic investors in this sector. The growth of the IVF industry itself in India has been fueled both by domestic greenfield clinics and hospitals which are existing, as well as by interest from private equity investors. The likes of the Kedara and Asia Healthcare Holdings, etc., have invested heavily in the IVF market. India's IVF market is, which was close to around 800 odd million in 2020, is expected to reach around $3.54 billion by 2030. So that's a huge market which is, which exists in India for assisted reproductive technology. In a world where aspirations of parenthood often intersect with medical complexities, infertility has become a pervasive concern. India, despite being the most populous country in the world, has a rapidly declining fertility rate of approximately 20% in the last decade. In the recent years, India has witnessed remarkable advancements in medical sciences. And one area that stands out is, of course, assisted reproductive technology. IVF, a pioneering technique that enables couples facing fertility challenges to fulfill their dreams of parenthood, has gained significant traction in the country. As we all know, the method involves the fertilization of an egg with sperm outside the body, and the subsequent embryo, and the embryo is then implanted in the uterus. Several factors contribute to the growing popularity of IVF in India. Changing lifestyles, delayed pregnancies, increased awareness about fertility treatments have all played pivotal roles. India's IVF industry has embraced cutting-edge technologies with state-of-the-art facilities equipped with the latest reproductive technologies, from pre-implantation genetic screening to advancements in embryo selection. These innovations have all significantly improved the success rates and expanded the range of possibilities for couples undergoing fertility treatments. India has also become a very favorable destination for IVF due to reduced costs, availability of the latest medical technologies, and little to no language barrier. And this is not only in the IVF space, but across when it comes to medical tourism. India is becoming a hub. Medical tourism in India is expected to hit close to around 13 billion in the next 2 years. While the IVF industry has witnessed tremendous growth, it is not without its challenges. Addressing socio-cultural stigma associated with infertility, ensuring accessibility to treatments across diverse demographics, navigating ethical dimensions of assisted reproduction are some of the critical issues that merit attention. If we look at the regulatory framework, there weren't too many regulations till 2021. This has evolved to ensure ethical practices and patient safety, and that's with the introduction of the Assisted Reproductive Technology Act of 2021. This act, along with the guidelines set by the ICMR, which is the Indian Council of Medical Research, fosters a responsible and accountable environment, safeguarding the interests of all stakeholders. In today's webinar, we aim to explore the current landscape of the IVF industry and delve deep into understanding the regulatory framework surrounding IVF in India. Before I excuse me, before I hand over the webinar to my colleagues, let me give you a quick introduction to the firm and to the panelists. Spice Root Legal is one of India's leading firms, and we are a full-service law firm. One of the sectors that we focus, amongst the many others, is healthcare and life sciences. We do work across a range of participants in this industry. We also assist our clients across the spectrum of work, right from commercial and regulatory assistance to transactional matters. My name is Praveen Raju, and I'm one of the founding partners of Spice Root Legal, and I lead the healthcare and life sciences practice and the corporate M&A practice. I will hand it over to Renuka and Himanshu, who are the co-panelists on this, and they will introduce themselves, and Renuka, then you can just take it forward. Sorry, Renuka, just before you start, just one thing, there is a Q&A box. You can put in your questions over there, and we will address those questions as we go along or at the end of the webinar. Thank you. Renuka, over to you.
Thank you, Praveen. Hi, everyone. My name is Renuka Abraham, and I'm a senior associate with the healthcare and life sciences team at Spice Root Legal.
Hi, everyone. I'm Himanshu. I'm an associate at Spice Root Legal in the healthcare, pharmaceutical, and life sciences team.
So we'll begin the session. Today, like Praveen mentioned, we'll be looking at a brief overview of the regulations on assisted reproductive technology in India, particularly regulations with respect to IVF or in vitro fertilization. Today's session will be split into two parts. We will start with a brief introduction on what is IVF and what are some key procedures that go into IVF. Moving on to, we will look at some key rules and regulations governing IVF, along with a look at the foreign direct investment regulations. So to begin with, why it's important to look at the regulations on ART in India is because, like Praveen mentioned, even though fertility is on the rise, there is still growth in science and medicine, which has made it possible to conceive and become parents, even if you suffer from fertility issues. So the method that's currently in the market is through assisted reproductive technologies. So there are various forms of ART available in the market. So there's IVF, there's embryo transfer, there's egg donation, there's artificial insemination, and so on. One method of ART and the most commonly used method is IVF, which we will be concentrating today on our webinar. In simple words, IVF is when the sperm of a male and the egg of a female are fertilized outside the human body, and once fertilized, the fertilized egg is placed inside the uterus. So colloquially, children born out of IVF were called as test tube babies because the fertilization itself takes place in a test tube. There are 5 primarily main procedures that go into IVF. There are other smaller procedures as well, but there are 5 key procedures. First is starting with medication, which whether in the form of hormonal like injection or drugs, to the couple who have medical issues associated with fertility. The second key step is the harvesting of the eggs and sperm, which is taking out the eggs and the sperm from the human body. The third important step is the fertilization of the gamete. So gamete can be the sperm or the egg, where fertilization happens in a lab. The fourth step is embryo culture, when the eggs are removed from the ovaries so that it can allow fertilization. And the last and the most important step is the embryo transfer, when the egg is placed in the woman's uterus. So these are the 5 main steps. And once these steps are completed, then pregnancy may happen. So interestingly, in IVF, either the couple's own sperm and eggs can be used, or it can come from donors as well, and the Indian regulations permit that. Also, in some cases, gestational carriers are used, which is when another woman's uterus is used for pregnancy, and this is called as surrogacy.
Surrogacy is regulated separately in India under the surrogacy regulations. There is a rapid growth of use of IVF,
and there are more than 2,500 fertility clinics across the country which does IVF treatments. Some well-known brands like Apollo and Rainbow Children's Hospital all have super specialty wings set up especially for IVF. There are also various IVF banks set up across the country, which acts as a repository of the sperm and the eggs. So the main regulation in India on ART is the Assisted Reproductive Technology Act of 2021 and the ICMR, or the Indian Council of Medical Research guidelines, which are formulated. There is no specific regulation on IVF, and IVF is also covered under the gambit of the ART Act. Before ART, the 2021 Act came into force, there were a lot of issues in the market, and so it became important that IVF and ART, it became important that it became regulated. Because many women above the age of 60 years, although they were able to conceive, and many called it as a medical miracle, there was still a lot of health concerns which affected women because of the age. Also, a lot of clinics in the country were functioning without a proper license, and it became difficult for ICMR to regulate and oversee. The third important issue was sex determination. So as you may or may not know, sex determination is a punishable offense in India, and many unlicensed clinics were performing sex determination because, however, it is still a crime. So in the next segment, Himanshu will take us through a brief overview of the regulations on ART. Over to you, Himanshu.
Thanks, Renuka. So ART, it's a term that includes a bunch of medical techniques helping people who face challenges in conceiving naturally. We are talking about IVF, intrauterine insemination, gamete donations, etc. So it is making parenthood possible for those dealing with infertility or other reproductive health hiccups. But as you know, with great power comes great responsibility. It brings its fair share of ethical, legal, and social dilemmas as well. Think of treating human gametes like commodities, clinics running wild without any regulation, and the whole deal about the rights and well-being of kids born through ART. As IVF became more widespread, so did the need to keep an eye on these clinics and ensure the well-being of everyone involved. This is where the ART Act kicks in. It came into force in January 2022 with a crystal clear mission. It's here to lay down the law, set the ethical standards, and keep tabs on the assisted reproductive technology clinics and banks. It has been enacted to tackle issues like reproductive health, freezing gametes, embryos, tissues, and also overseeing research and development in the field. So it gives us the lowdown on all the tricky terms and the treatment in assisted reproduction, some of which have already been discussed by Renuka previously. And the Act's main aim is to keep tabs on how ART clinics and banks are functioning. It also lays down the guidelines for using human gametes, embryos, and oocytes. So in a nutshell, the Act isn't just a bunch of legal jargon. It's a guidebook making sure that the world of assisted reproductive technology stays ethical, safe, and accountable. So it's a way of keeping the powers of ART in check so that everyone's journey to parenthood is a smooth and ethical ride. Now, let's break down who can avail IVF. So it's open for a commissioning couple, a married duo facing some roadblocks in conceiving naturally. The female should be between the age of 21 to 50, and the male should be between the age of 21 to 55. A single woman can also avail IVF if they're above 21 and below 50. If someone's pitching in as a sperm donor, they should be between 21 and 55. And for an oocyte donor, should be between 23 and 35. But here's the scoop. As per the rules of India, it's a bit exclusive. So if you're not in a heterosexual married duo or a single woman above 21, then the ART might not be rolling out the welcome mat for you. A single men, same-sex couples, live-in couples, and the LGBTQ community are unfortunately on the excluded list. Now, there's been a bit of a stir about this. IVF specialists across India did move and file a petition with the Supreme Court. They argued that the current rules leave out single men, same-sex couples, and live-in couples from the Art Act's party. They're also shaking their heads at what they call unscientific and irrational restrictions, like limiting the number of donations a lady can make. The petition, among other things, also points a finger at the lack of cash compensation for oocyte donors, calling it a big oversight since it failed to consider the time and wages lost during an egg retrieval surgery. Now, taking into account the recent developments around same-sex marriage in India, we will have to see how the situation evolves because that could potentially impact this petition as well. Now, the Art Act and its rule book have a say in the consent game as well. So if you're in for an intrauterine insemination with a donor sperm, a consent form is the backstage pass. So for a commissioning couple, both partners need to sign on the dotted line. Again, but there was some courtroom drama around this as well. There was this lady wanting to go to the IVF route with a donor sperm, but her estranged husband wasn't throwing in his consent. So the Supreme Court, pointing to a similar case in Melbourne, Australia, held that such rules should be struck down. Now let's look at the Art Act and some of its important features. So the Act kicks off by setting up a national board and a state board to be the watchdogs of all things art across the country. The national board is responsible for laying down the law, the policies, standards, and guidelines for art. Meanwhile, the state board takes these rules and runs with them in each state, making sure everyone's on the same page. The Act is also about fostering an environment of research and development in the art world. So it sets up a national registry. Think of it like a data hub collecting, analyzing, and spreading the word on how art is doing in India, keeping everyone in the loop. The Act also hands the central government the ability to form rules and regulations for making sure that the Act is doing its job. Plus, they can always drop in guidelines, notifications, and orders, serving the purpose of clarifying the intricacies within the realm of art for all stakeholders. So to sum up, there's a combo of boards keeping things in check, a spotlight on research and development, and a rule book to make sure everything's running as smooth as a well-oiled machine. Now, let's break down the nitty-gritty of what the Art Act wants everyone to do. So the clinics and banks, most importantly, should make sure that everyone involved, from the commissioning couple to the donor, is eligible and has given a nod through informed written consent. If you're dealing with donor gametes, get them from the banks, and these banks have to ensure that these donors are medically fit. They also have to provide counseling to the commissioning couple and women, and they should lay out all the pros and cons, spill the beans on the costs, the potential side effects, and the potential risks. It is their responsibility to make sure that everyone knows their rights. Now, they should have a designated complaint corner as well, a grievance cell, and let people know how to complain if something's off. They will have to issue a certificate after an art procedure with a report which details on what went down. And they will always be open for inspection by the watchdogs, which are the national board, the registry, and the state board. So these clinics also have to ensure record keeping. So details of all records of every little thing related to donor gametes, all the details, they have to share all these details online, which includes the enrollment procedures, outcomes with the national registry, and they have to do this within a month. They need to keep these records for at least 10 years or until they shut down, and hand them over to the national registry. And they are always open for inspection anytime and anywhere. Now, there are certain rules that these clinics and banks have to ensure using gametes and embryos. So first is that they can't go overboard, which means that they cannot place more than 3 oocytes or embryos in a woman's uterus during one treatment cycle. A woman should not be treated with gametes or embryos derived from more than one man or one woman during one treatment cycle. They cannot mix semen from 2 different individuals. I know it might sound like a punchline, but it's a serious matter. The NCDRC penalized the Bhatia Global Hospital with a fine of 1.5 crores for negligence and resorting to unethical practices. So what had happened was that the complainants underwent an IVF procedure that led to birth of twin girls, and the blood type of one of the twins did not match that of the complainant, which prompted them to undergo a paternity test using DNA profiling. And the results stunned the couple, as it revealed that the husband was not the biological father of the twin girls. The doctors and the hospital staff indulge in this negligent practice of early mixing of donor gametes without the knowledge of the patient, just to increase the success rate. So the commission emphasized the repercussions of flawed protocols, including the emotional and financial toll on infertility patients, underscoring the need for precise and compassionate care. Now, there is something called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. It is when one or both genetic parents have a known genetic abnormality, and testing is performed on an embryo to determine if it also carries that genetic abnormality. So pre-implantation genetic testing it's used to identify genetic defects in embryos created through IVF before pregnancy. A donation of an embryo after pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to any approved research laboratory for research purposes can only be done with the approval of the commissioning couple or woman, and when the embryo suffers from pre-existing heritable, life-threatening, or genetic diseases. The national board can always throw in some extra conditions if required. Now, if you're an IVF bank, you've got some responsibilities again. You need to screen your gamete donors and get sperm from male between 21 to 55, and from women, oocytes from women between 23 to 35. One donor sperm or oocyte can only be provided to one commissioning couple, and an oocyte donor can donate only once in a life and only retrieve a max of seven oocytes. Unused ones can be saved for the same recipient or handed over for research with the commissioning couple's written thumbs up. Now, if we look at registration, the Act mandates that all IVF clinics and banks conducting ART partly or exclusively in India, they need to register themselves with the National Registry. The approval for the registration of clinics and banks will be granted by the relevant authority upon ensuring that these entities have the capability to furnish facilities, to uphold necessary equipment and standards. They should have specialized manpower, physical infrastructure, and diagnostic facilities. Now, these clinics, they get a classification makeover. So there's level 1. Level 1 are the clinics where preliminary investigations are carried out, including diagnosis of type and cause of infertility. So they are like the detectives. They figure out the issue. They mainly do basic investigations and kick off with intrauterine insemination. And then there's level 2, which is the advanced cohort. They are the ones diving deep into the techniques that attempt to obtain a pregnancy. Now, if you want to become an IVF bank, you need to be ready for some heavy lifting again, screening and collecting the sperms from the sperm donors, freezing the sperms, screening and registering oocyte donors, and playing the role of a sperm and oocyte bank. And yes, the national registry has to be kept in the loop always. These clinics and these banks need to fill out certain forms, but the registration comes after a thorough inspection by the state board. So the granted registration is valid for a period of 5 years, following which the IVF clinic or the bank must reapply. It is mandatory for all these clinics and banks to prominently display the registration certificate at the premises, indicating the duration of its validity. Now, we look at penalties. Before the ART Act came to the rescue, it was like a Wild West situation for healthcare pros in the IVF game. The regulatory scenario lacked clarity regarding the penalties that could be imposed for unethical conduct during an IVF procedure. Although the ICMR guidelines allowed for the imposition of penalties, the specific details were absent, leading to instances where healthcare professionals evaded accountability for questionable practices. But now the Act spells out the penalty, so there's no one playing any guessing game. So the clinics, the banks, and their affiliates, they are prohibited from engaging in overt advertising, particularly when it comes to promoting selective features in children. A violation of this rule carries significant legal consequences. As per the ART Act, individual or entities found in breach could face imprisonment ranging from 5 to 10 years, or incur a substantial fine ranging from 10 to 25 lakh rupees, or both. Now, these stringent provisions underscore the gravity of the offense and emphasize the importance of adhering to ethical practices in the realm of assisted reproductive technology. The Act establishes a comprehensive set of regulations governing various aspects of assisted reproductive technology. It explicitly prohibits certain activities within the realm of assisted reproductive procedures. These are, again, but are not limited to abandoning or exploiting children born through art, selling embryos or gametes, operating agencies involved in such transactions, and importing embryos or gametes. Exploitation of the commissioning couple, women, or gamete donors is strictly prohibited. Additionally, the Act prohibits the transfer of human embryos into male individuals or animals, as well as the sale of embryos or gametes for research purposes. Non-compliance with these regulations entails substantial penalties. So for the first contravention, the fines could range from 5 to 10 lakh rupees. And in the case of subsequent violations, individuals could face imprisonment as well for a term not less than 3 years, but could extend up to 8 years, coupled with fines as well, ranging from 10 to 20 lakh rupees. Now, in the event of any wrongdoing by a clinic or bank, the person in charge is automatically in the hot seat, unless they can prove that they had no clue of what was going on. Moreover, if any subordinate was involved in the misconduct, they are also not exempt from scrutiny, as the principle of guilty by association applies. Now I'll hand it over to Renuka to take us through the next bits of our presentation.
Thank you, Himanshu. So we'll start with, firstly, as per the Act and the regulation, what are the rights of the various parties involved? So, like Himanshu mentioned, there is the commissioning couple, there are donors and surrogates if it's used, and lastly, the most important party in the IVF cycle is the child born out of IVF. So, starting with the rights of the children, the Act and the ICMR guidelines indicate that any child born through IVF will be deemed to be the biological child of the commissioning couple, and this child would be entitled to all rights and privileges available to a natural child. So whether it's parental support or inheritance, all of that will be available to the child born out of IVF as well. The second important right with respect to the privacy of identity of the donor and the surrogates. So the ICMR guidelines state that the children and their parents, right, that's the commissioning couple, will only have a right to the medical or genetic information of the donor. So like Himanshu mentioned previously, if you have any abnormality or if you have any medical history, then that will be available because that directly affects the child born out of IVF. But other identity like the name,
age, or the parentage of the donor is not available.
There was interestingly a case in the Kerala High Court where a single woman had conceived a child through IVF. And one of the forms that she was required to fill had a column for filling in the father's name of the child. Now, because she had used the donor, she had no idea on who the father was. So she approached the court to reveal the identity of the father. But in this case, the court ruled in favor of the donor and held that the ICMR guidelines and the Art Act, which was then a bill, had clearly said that the disclosure of the identity of the donor would be a violation of the right to privacy. And in this case, the father's name was not revealed. The third important right is on relinquishment of rights. So the Act laid down that a donor or a surrogate has to relinquish all parental rights over the child or children who may be born from his or her gametes. The next segment that we will look at is on the foreign direct investment policy. So the general rule for FDI is that 100% FDI is permitted under the automatic route for the construction and development of hospitals. There is nothing specifically under the FDI guidelines for ART or IVF, but because IVF mostly they are clinics or hospitals, it will fall under this category of construction and development of hospitals. However, when it comes to pharma, only 74% FDI is permitted. So even though pharma is not directly applicable in our case, we just wanted to bring to your attention that pharma investment beyond 74% requires the approval of the government.
Just to clarify
Because
there, it is only in the case of it's greenfield versus brownfield. So when it comes to greenfield projects, it's 100% in brownfield is 74. But again, as Renuka mentioned, I don't think that this may be relevant in the case of IVF, because IVF will all be clinics and therefore it's 100%. Sorry, Renuka, continue.
Yeah, no problem. So because IVF, because foreign direct investment is open through the IVF sector, there have been a lot of investments from non-residents in the past. One example being Whirl Invest, where they acquired a controlling stake in a company called 49 Fertility Center. The main aim of 49 Fertility Center is to build a platform and to acquire fertility clinics across major cities in India. In the next segment, we will look at, while we've already looked at all the legal requirements when it comes to IVF, there are still certain ethical practices when it comes to IVF. Starting with, like Himanshu mentioned, informed consent and information. So there are several complications that arise out of IVF. And it's very important that the risks associated with the procedure or even the potential outcome must be provided to the parties. The second important criteria is on discrimination. So there can't be any form of discrimination of the commissioning couple, whether in the form of race or even caste. The next important ethical factor is on confidentiality, because there are a lot of sensitive medical information shared, including the identity of the donor and the surrogate. It's important that the right to privacy must be protected. The next factor is embryo disposition, because there will be unused embryos out of an IVF treatment. It's important that there must be clear policies laid down regarding the disposition of the unused embryos. And the last important factor is on cost. So while the cost in IVF in India is lesser compared to other countries, it is still high to have an IVF baby, because there is no cap that the government has brought in this sector. So to tackle this, there are various schemes and initiatives brought in by the government to make IVF affordable. A good example being Goa. Goa is a state in India which has actually encouraged IVF. They've encouraged IVF in two ways. One, for scheduled tribal couples, where they have provided financial assistance up to 5 lakhs if they are unable to conceive after 3 years of marriage. Not only this, even any couple in Goa who are unable to conceive have been offered free IVF treatments across in Goa at the Goa Medical College and Hospital. In the last segment, now Himanshu will continue on what is the impact that art has had in India. What, Himanshu?
Thanks, Renuka. So picture this. Back in 86, when the first IVF baby was born, who knew that the whole game would level up so much? And fast forward to now, IVF in India is practically unrecognizable. We are talking about game-changing advancements, a pre-implantation genetic testing, super precise hormonal plans, and even AI getting in on the action for top-notch embryo selection. Plus, people are talking about it more. Infertility isn't hiding in the shadows anymore. More people know about IVF, and that's partly thanks to a solid governance setup. Now, fertility clinics have ethical guidelines to follow, bringing in more transparency and keeping patients safe. So it's a win-win. These positive developments not only empower individuals and couples to make informed choices about their reproductive health, but also contribute to the overall growth and reliability of the IVF industry in India. The combination of heightened awareness and improved governance is shaping a more promising future for the IVF industry. International investors are eyeing India's healthcare playground. thanks to the top-notch tech and government support, the Indian IVF scenario is becoming a global hotspot. However, there is a not so glamorous side as well. As Renuka mentioned, the high cost of IVF, it's a major barrier to access for many couples and is a prominent cause behind couples deterring to avail the treatment. For a larger outreach, it is important to make IVF more affordable. The procedure can be made affordable to the public at large through measures such as government subsidies, inclusion of cost of health insurance coverage, reduction in the cost of medications, etc. Currently, the government initiatives present in India are restricted to a very small segment of the population, and there is a need for policy schemes or any other initiatives to make IVF a favorable option across India. The legal framework governing art in India, it's largely similar to the systems adopted by a large number of European Union nations. These international frameworks also provide the parameters, rules, guidelines for the procedures which are akin to the Indian framework. However, an additional aspect that we see in France, Belgium, and Germany is state funding. The state reimburses or funds fully or partially the cost of the art treatment. Given that cost is a factor that discourages patients from accessing art treatments, the inclusion of funding art treatments in the government insurance scheme can boost the art industry in India. So there you have it. IVF in India, it's a mix of cheers and challenges. And it's a journey like any adventure. It's got its own highs and lows. Here's to hoping that the future brings more accessible, inclusive, and affordable art for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Renuka. Thanks, Himanshu. I think that's really informative. Just to conclude, with the Art Act of 2021, I think the framework and the lay of the land has changed substantially. The fact that it has brought in established global acceptable procedures and practices and safety protocols have ensured that the industry and the sector is not going overboard with the procedures or with and ensuring that there is safety and adequate measures taken in the practice of IVF. So we believe that I think that the regulatory framework has helped in creating a base structure for clinics and for players in the market to kind of understand what the regulatory framework is and make sure that they are complying with all of that. And it's also led to kind of, I think that investor interest in the market has kind of become more, we can see a lot more investor interest and a lot more international players entering the market because there is a very clear regulatory framework. There are bottlenecks. I think there is bureaucracy around registrations and approvals, etc. But those are challenges that we face across sectors, and it is not only this sector. But that the 2021 Act is a welcome move. Like Himanshu concluded, yes, there are always challenges, but I think that with the ICMR coming out with their specified rules, etc., and changes depending on what happens in the industry on a regular basis, will kind of ensure that those challenges are also kind of addressed as we go along. Thank you, everyone. I think that I think we have a few questions. Let me kind of so let's take a look. I think the first one was on if there was a question which kind of, so I'll read it out. It said, you mentioned earlier that there was a case involving an IVF center where the paternity test showed that the husband was not the genetic father. In such a case, can the father abandon the child? Or even in this case, will the law of non-abandonment be applicable? So yes, the law of non-abandonment will be applicable while you may have recourses to damages, etc., which was very clear from the judgment of the Supreme Court. The law of non-abandonment will continue to be applicable, and the parents will be responsible for the child that was born through IVF. There is another question. I'm not sure if I have the answer. Renuka, Himanshu, I don't know if you have the answers. Can you just take that up?
Yeah, sure. So the next question is whether a single woman coming to India can avail IVF treatment. Yes, it is possible. There is no nationality or citizenship restriction under the Art Act. So any single woman, whether in India or abroad, can avail an IVF treatment. Your second part of the question is on difficulties with respect to IVF. So like we've mentioned, cost is one factor which would affect the woman because IVF treatments are relatively expensive. Other than that, there are no differentiation with respect to a single woman or a commissioning couple.
Yeah,
Himanshu, anything else that you want to add?
Sorry, just to add to that, and like we said earlier, IVF is a big medical tourism industry for India. So therefore, there are a lot of people who come from different countries into India for IVF. While cost as a factor has been indicated by both Renuka and Himanshu, I think that as a comparison of cost between what is there in India and the Western countries or other more developed countries, the cost is still a lot more affordable than what it would be outside. And therefore, it is a big avenue for medical tourism. So I think that's it. Do we have any other questions? We can give it another minute if you have any more questions on this front. While if there are any more questions which are coming, we're happy to kind of answer them. But just to quickly conclude, like we mentioned in the beginning, we have a very strong healthcare and life sciences practice. We help companies and clinics across this country, both from a regulatory as well as commercial, from a commercial standpoint. We've been involved in multiple private equity investments and M&A transactions in this sector. You could log on to our website, which is www.spicerootlegal.com, and you could get details over there on the kind of work that we do in this sector as well. Please feel free to reach out to any of us. I think our contact details are here. You probably do also have our email IDs. I think we'll probably send this across to you. We'll also be live on, we'll have the webinar up on YouTube. So if you need to go back and look at anything that we have mentioned, but please feel free to reach out to us. I think there's one other question from Kartikeya. Renuka, Himanshu, can IVF clinic advertise its successfully treated patients, including their videos subject to advertisement compliances? So I think there are two parts to this. I will let Renuka and Himanshu take on the IVF piece, but I think that from a data compliance, from a data and privacy perspective, that won't be possible unless you get their consent. So you need to have their consent, which is the case even with advertisement compliances and advertisement regulations, right? But separately on advertisements, I think that there's something specifically under the ART Act, right? Renuka, Himanshu, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there are no restrictions when it comes to advertisement as such under the IVF Act. But you can't make any claims or anything that the regular Drugs Act would apply. But there's no issue on mentioning about what are the treatments that the patients have gone through.
Right. Kartikeya, so I don't think that there may be any restrictions on that, but we can kind of think through this and come back to you with specific answers. I don't think it is just going to be a question of only what is provided under the ART Act, but it will also extend to the new data law, which is there, which we believe will be implemented very soon with rules around it. And this would probably be one of the questions which would arise, which would come up on that.
Just to add to that, there is a disqualification list mentioned on things that you can't advertise on. So the presumption would be that you could advertise again subject to data compliance laws and consent.
Kartikeya, I think that that's a tricky question to answer. Can we mask the faces and do an advertisement? I think that we will need to do some analysis, but my guess would be that that would be difficult. I think that it's as good at, even if you were to mask faces, I think in a video advertisement that you're doing, you are getting somebody to speak and say something. So I think it's going to be driven by consent rather than masking faces. As long as there is consent to use the person's video or the person's statement in a particular manner, we believe that there should be no problem. But that's something that will probably need a little more evaluation from a separate team which looks at data. But happy to answer your questions. You can just drop us an email and we can help you with that. Okay, perfect. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any further questions. Thank you. Bye. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.